There is a dangerous illusion unfolding right now in global politics. An illusion so subtle that most people do not even notice it, yet so powerful that it could quietly reshape the balance of power across the entire world. It begins with a simple claim: Japan is weak. At first glance, it almost sounds reasonable. A country with a pacifist constitution, a nation that has not fought a war in decades, a military that on paper is limited by its own laws. And now, a former American president openly calling it out, questioning its strength, its contributions, even its value as an ally. But here's the unsettling truth. What looks like weakness is often restraint, and what is dismissed as dependency may actually be one of the most sophisticated forms of power ever constructed. Because what we are witnessing is not just a disagreement between Washington and Tokyo. It is not just about tariffs or defense spending. It is something far more consequential. It is the slow erosion of a relationship that has quietly held together one of the most stable regions on Earth. And the most alarming part is this: the person accelerating that erosion may not even understand what is being lost. To understand why this matters, you need to step back, way back, beyond the headlines, beyond the political noise, into the deeper logic of how power actually works in the modern world. Most people think power is obvious. It is measured in tanks, in missiles, in military budgets, in who can shout the loudest or impose the harshest tariffs. But real power, the kind that shapes history, rarely looks like that. Real power is quiet. It is embedded in systems, in relationships, in decades of trust that allow nations to act without fear of betrayal. It is the invisible architecture that keeps conflict from erupting, not because it cannot happen, but because no one dares to risk breaking the system. And that is exactly what the US-Japan alliance has been. Not a favor, not a burden, but a piece of strategic infrastructure so critical that entire economies and geopolitical assumptions have been built on top of it. Now imagine what happens when that infrastructure starts to crack. Not explode overnight, but slowly, quietly, through words, through signals, through a growing sense that the rules of the relationship are no longer stable. When a leader begins to describe an ally not as a partner, but as a liability, when trust is replaced by suspicion, something shifts. And here is where the comparison becomes impossible to ignore. We have seen this pattern before. A nation reframed as a burden, negotiations turned into ultimatums, complexity reduced to a single blunt question. It is a mindset that works in business deals, but in geopolitics, it can be catastrophic. Because alliances are not transactions, they are commitments. And once they feel negotiable, their power starts to evaporate. And that is the real story here. Not whether Japan is weak, but what happens when the US treats an ally as if it were. Because if that trust erodes, the consequences will not stay confined to Tokyo or Washington. They will ripple outward, into military strategy, into economic systems, into the calculations of rivals who are watching closely, waiting for signs of fracture. By the time the cracks turn into breaks, it may be too late. What if the real weakness is not where everyone thinks it is? The idea that Japan is weak does not come from nowhere. It is built on a surface-level reading of reality, one that focuses on what is visible while ignoring what actually drives the modern global system. On paper, Japan does look constrained. Its constitution renounces war. Its military is labeled as self-defense. Its leaders speak cautiously about power, often avoiding the kind of aggressive rhetoric that dominates global politics today. But this is where the illusion begins. Because in the 21st century, power has evolved. It no longer announces itself with marching armies and territorial conquest. It embeds itself in supply chains, in financial systems, in technological dependencies that shape how entire societies function. And by that standard, Japan is not weak. It is indispensable. Start with the economy because this is where the misunderstanding is most obvious. The argument goes like this. The United States runs a trade deficit with Japan. Therefore, Japan must be taking advantage. Therefore, Japan must somehow be weaker or dependent. But that logic collapses the moment you ask a better question. Why does that deficit exist in the first place? Trade deficits are not created by force. They are created by demand. Americans buy Japanese goods because those goods are trusted, precise, and often irreplaceable within the systems they operate in. When a car contains critical components manufactured in Japan, when semiconductor production relies on Japanese machinery, when global data infrastructure depends on materials and technologies perfected by Japanese firms, you are no longer looking at a simple buyer-seller relationship. You are looking at structural reliance. And this is the part that is so often missed. Japan does not dominate through volume. It dominates through precision, through control of key nodes in the global system that cannot easily be substituted or replicated. In other words, Japan has positioned itself not at the edges of the system, but at its pressure points. Remove those pressure points, and the system does not just slow down, it destabilizes. This is why some of the most influential Japanese companies do not need to be loud to be powerful. They operate quietly upstream in the production process, where their influence is invisible to the average consumer, but absolutely critical to the final product. It is a different model of power, less visible, less theatrical, but in many ways more resilient. And then there is the financial dimension, which is even less understood. Japan is one of the largest holders of United States government debt. That fact alone should fundamentally change how you think about the relationship. Because holding that level of debt is not just an investment. It is a form of financial interdependence that binds the two economies together in ways that are both stabilizing and deeply strategic. It means Japan has a stake in American stability. And it means America, whether it acknowledges it or not, operates within a system that Japan helps sustain. This is not weakness, this is entanglement. But perhaps the most revealing part of this entire illusion is psychological. There is a tendency in global politics to equate silence with passivity, to assume that countries that do not constantly assert themselves must lack the capacity to do so. Japan has mastered the opposite approach. It has chosen deliberately to operate without drawing attention to its leverage, to influence without provoking, to build dependencies without triggering resistance. This is not accidental, it is strategic. Because overt displays of power invite confrontation. But embedded power, the kind that becomes part of how the world functions, is far harder to challenge. And that is exactly what Japan represents. A country that rebuilt itself from devastation, not by projecting force, but by integrating itself so deeply into the global system, that removing it would be both costly and destabilizing for everyone involved. So when someone looks at that system and sees weakness, what they are really revealing is not a flaw in Japan. They are revealing a misunderstanding of what power looks like today. Because the strongest players in the modern world are not always the ones who dominate headlines, they are the ones you cannot afford to lose. And once you understand that, once you see Japan not as a peripheral player, but as a central pillar of the global system, the entire conversation begins to shift. Because now the question is no longer whether Japan is weak. The question is, what happens to the system if a country like that is pushed away? To understand what is truly at stake, you have to look beyond economics and into something far more fragile and far more powerful. Geography. It is the permanent reality that shapes our world. Because while economies can shift and technologies can evolve, geography is permanent. And Japan's geography may be one of the most strategically valuable realities in the entire modern world. Look at a map of East Asia. Japan is not just a country. It is a chain of islands stretching like a barrier along the edge of the Pacific, sitting between the Asian mainland and the open ocean. It forms what military strategists call a natural containment line, a position that quietly shapes the movement of fleets, the projection of power, and the balance of influence across the entire Indo Pacific. This is not theoretical. This is the physical foundation of modern strategy. This is the physical foundation of American strategy in Asia. For decades, the United States has maintained military bases across Japan: Okinawa, Yokosuka, Misawa. These are not symbolic presences. They are forward operating platforms that allow the United States to respond rapidly to crises, monitor regional activity, and project power in ways that would be impossible from the American mainland alone. Without them, everything changes. Response times increase, operational costs rise, strategic flexibility shrinks, and perhaps most importantly, deterrence weakens. Because deterrence is not just about capability, it is about proximity. It is about being close enough, present enough, credible enough that no adversary is willing to test the system. Japan provides that proximity. And here is the critical point that is so often misunderstood. These bases are not acts of generosity from the United States. They are assets. They exist not because America is protecting Japan out of goodwill, but because maintaining a presence in Japan allows the United States to anchor its influence across an entire region. That includes China, North Korea, Taiwan, and some of the most vital shipping lanes on Earth. In other words, the alliance is not one-sided, it is mutually reinforcing. And that mutual reinforcement is what has kept the region relatively stable for decades. Not perfectly stable, not free of tension, but stable enough to prevent large-scale conflict between major powers. Now imagine what happens when that foundation begins to erode, not through a formal withdrawal, not through a sudden collapse, but through something much quieter: doubt. When an ally begins to question whether the commitment on the other side is still reliable. When political rhetoric introduces uncertainty into what was once assumed to be guaranteed. When leaders start to wonder whether, in a moment of crisis, support will actually arrive. That doubt changes behavior, because countries do not wait for alliances to fail before they adapt. They anticipate, they hedge, they prepare for scenarios in which the system they relied on no longer functions the way it used to. And this is where the situation becomes far more serious than a simple diplomatic disagreement. Because once Japan begins to question the reliability of the United States, it is not just a shift in perception. It is the beginning of a structural transformation. A transformation in how Japan thinks about its own security. A transformation in how it positions itself in relation to China. A transformation in how the entire region recalculates risk. And here is where another layer of reality comes into focus. China is watching carefully. Because from Beijing's perspective, the US-Japan alliance is one of the primary obstacles to expanding its influence across the Western Pacific. It is the barrier that complicates any attempt to assert control over contested areas, including Taiwan and the South China Sea. If that barrier weakens, even slightly, the strategic landscape shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but enough to create openings, enough to test boundaries, enough to probe for advantage. And in geopolitics, small openings can lead to large consequences. This is why alliances matter far beyond the countries directly involved. They shape expectations, they define limits. They create invisible lines that, when respected, keep competition from turning into conflict. But when those lines begin to blur, when the signals become inconsistent, when words and actions no longer align, the system loses clarity. And without clarity, miscalculation becomes more likely. A misinterpreted signal, a delayed response, a test that escalates further than intended. History is filled with moments like this. Moments where the breakdown of trust did not immediately cause conflict, but created the conditions in which conflict became far more probable. And that is the real danger here. Not that the alliance disappears overnight, but that it becomes uncertain. Because in a system built on trust, uncertainty is the first step toward instability. And once instability takes hold, it rarely stays contained. History is filled with moments where the breakdown of trust did not immediately cause conflict, but created the conditions for it. In a system built on trust, uncertainty is the first step toward instability. And once instability takes hold, it rarely stays contained. And this is where the story takes a turn that most people never see coming. Because while the world debates whether Japan is weak, Japan itself has already moved on from that question. Quietly, deliberately, and with a level of strategic discipline that is almost invisible from the outside. Over the past few years, Japan has begun to transform its military posture in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. Defense budgets are rising, new capabilities are being developed. And most importantly, the very philosophy of defense is changing. For decades, Japan's strategy was built around absorption. The idea was simple. Defend, endure, and rely on the United States to project power beyond its borders. But that logic is now shifting. Japan is moving toward deterrence by denial and, increasingly, deterrence by punishment. That means not just absorbing an attack, but having the ability to strike back, to reach targets before threats fully materialize. This includes long-range missile systems, advanced surveillance networks, integration with cutting-edge technologies that blur the line between defense and offense. And here's the part that should make you pause. None of this is happening in a vacuum. It is happening in response to a changing environment, a more assertive China, an unpredictable North Korea, and now a growing uncertainty about whether the United States will remain as reliable as it once was. Because when trust weakens, self-reliance rises. This is not about Japan becoming aggressive, it is about Japan becoming prepared. But preparation has consequences, because the moment Japan steps beyond the constraints that defined its post-war identity, even slightly, the entire region takes notice. China notices. And China does not interpret Japanese rearmament in isolation. It interprets it through history, through memory, through unresolved tensions that still shape national identity and strategic thinking. Through unresolved tensions that still shape national identity and strategic thinking. So even defensive moves can be perceived as escalation, and that perception triggers response. More military spending, more assertive positioning, more willingness to test boundaries. This is the beginning of what strategists call a security dilemma, where actions taken for defense are seen as threats, and those perceived threats justify further action in return. A cycle, one that feeds itself. Now layer one more possibility on top of that, nuclear capability. Japan has the technological expertise, the industrial base, and the material resources to develop nuclear weapons faster than almost any country on Earth. Not in decades, potentially in months if the political decision were ever made. For years, that decision has not been made because it did not need to be. The United States provided a nuclear umbrella, a guarantee that any existential threat to Japan would be met with overwhelming response. But guarantees only work if they are believed. When rhetoric begins to question commitments, when alliances feel conditional, even slightly, the calculus starts to change. Not publicly, not immediately, but internally, strategically, quietly. And that is how major shifts in global power begin, not with declarations, but with decisions made behind closed doors in response to a single, unsettling question: what if we are on our own? Now take everything we have discussed and push it one step further. Because geopolitics is never static. It reacts, it adapts, and sometimes it spirals. If Japan begins to move toward greater military independence, even cautiously, the effects will not stop at its borders. They will ripple outward, triggering reactions from every major player in the region. And no country will be watching more closely or reacting more decisively than China. From Beijing's perspective, Japan is not just another neighbor. It is a historical rival, a technological competitor, and a critical piece of the strategic puzzle that defines control over the Western Pacific. So when Japan changes, China recalculates. If Japan strengthens its military, China accelerates its own. If Japan signals uncertainty about American support, China tests that uncertainty. If the alliance weakens, China explores the gaps. This is not speculation. This is how power behaves. And this is where the chain reaction begins. Because once China responds, other countries cannot remain passive. South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, nations across Southeast Asia, all of them operate within the same security environment. All of them are sensitive to shifts in balance. And when the balance becomes unclear, they begin to hedge. More defense spending, more independent capabilities, more contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. This is how regional tension becomes systemic instability. But there is an even more dangerous layer beneath all of this: nuclear proliferation. For decades, East Asia has avoided a full-scale nuclear arms race, largely because of one central assumption: the United States would extend its nuclear deterrence to its allies. That umbrella allowed countries like Japan and South Korea to remain non-nuclear without feeling exposed. But if that umbrella begins to feel uncertain, even slightly, the logic changes. Because in a world where survival is at stake, no nation willingly remains vulnerable. Japan has the capability. South Korea has the capability. Others could follow. And once one country crosses that line, the pressure on others to do the same becomes almost impossible to resist. This is how nuclear chains begin. Not through aggression, but through fear. Not because countries want weapons, but because they no longer trust the system that once made those weapons unnecessary. And here is the most unsettling part. None of this requires a dramatic event to begin. No war declaration, no sudden collapse, just a gradual erosion of confidence, a comment that raises doubt, a policy that signals unpredictability, a pattern that suggests commitments are no longer absolute. And over time, that is enough. Because in international politics, perception shapes reality. If enough actors begin to believe that the old guarantees no longer hold, they will act accordingly. They will prepare. They will adjust. They will move. And by the time the consequences of those movements become visible, the system will already be different. More tense, more fragmented, more dangerous. This is the chain reaction that few people talk about, not because it is unlikely, but because it is uncomfortable to confront. Because it forces us to recognize that stability is not permanent. It is maintained carefully, constantly, through trust, through consistency, through relationships that are stronger than any single transaction. And when those relationships begin to weaken, the world does not immediately fall apart. It simply becomes a place where the margin for error gets smaller and smaller. So when you step back and look at the full picture, something deeper begins to emerge. This was never really about Japan, not about trade deficits, not about defense spending, not even about who is strong and who is weak. It is about how power is understood, because there are two fundamentally different ways to see the world. One is transactional, the other is structural. The transactional view is simple. Every relationship is a deal. Every ally is a cost. Every commitment must produce immediate, visible returns. If the numbers do not add up, the relationship is questioned, renegotiated, or discarded. It is clean, it is intuitive, and in certain contexts, it works. But the structural view is different. It sees power not as individual deals, but as systems, networks of relationships that, when combined, create something far greater than the sum of their parts. It understands that some of the most valuable assets do not generate immediate profit, but provide stability, leverage, and influence over time. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous, because the United States did not become a global power simply by being strong on its own. It became powerful by building and leading a network of alliances that extended its reach across continents, amplified its influence, and created a world in which its leadership was not just accepted, but expected. Japan is one of the central pillars of that network, not on the margins, not optional, central. Remove or weaken that pillar, and the structure does not immediately collapse, but it begins to lose integrity. It becomes more fragile, more vulnerable to pressure, more likely to crack under stress. And here is the irony that makes this entire situation so unsettling. In an attempt to appear stronger, to demand more, to extract better terms, the very foundation of that strength may be undermined. Because strength in the modern world is not just about what you can do alone. It is about what you can sustain together. It is about trust that does not have to be constantly renegotiated. It is about commitments that are credible because they are consistent. It is about relationships that endure beyond individual leaders, political cycles, and short-term calculations. When those elements are in place, power compounds. When they are not, power fragments. And fragmentation is where uncertainty lives. Now think about what that means on a global scale. If allies begin to question commitments, they act more independently. If they act more independently, coordination weakens. If coordination weakens, rivals find opportunities, not because they have suddenly become stronger, but because the system opposing them has become less cohesive. This is how balance shifts, quietly, gradually, then all at once. And this is why the narrative of weakness is so misleading. Japan is not weak. Japan is disciplined. Japan is calculated. Japan is operating within a framework that, until now, has allowed it to maximize security while minimizing risk. But frameworks can change. And when they do, countries adapt. Sometimes in ways that restore balance, sometimes in ways that accelerate instability. The outcome is not predetermined. But the direction is influenced by decisions being made right now. Decisions about how allies are treated, how commitments are communicated, how power itself is defined. Because if power continues to be reduced to transactions, if alliances continue to be evaluated as costs rather than strategic assets, then the world does not become simpler. It becomes more volatile, more uncertain, more prone to miscalculation. And in that kind of world, even small mistakes can carry enormous consequences. So the real question is not whether Japan can handle the challenges ahead. It can. The real question is whether the system that has kept those challenges contained for nearly a century will continue to hold, or whether, piece by piece, it will be reshaped into something far less stable. Because once that process begins, once the invisible architecture of trust starts to erode, rebuilding it is not a matter of policy. It is a matter of time. And history has shown time is the one resource you rarely have when the world starts to change.